Like everybody else, I'm a victim of my environment. I spent about 10 years of my life in the US Army. Before that, my dad served in Southeast Asia in the Air Force. In fact, my dad used to tell me this story, one of my favorite stories, about a mechanic who was up on a ladder inspecting the cockpit of an F-105 fighter bomber. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, a king cobra bit him on the posterior. He survived, but there's a lesson there. The lesson is easy. Your enemies will always strike where you're not looking. So I'm here to tell you about where to look for the attacks and how you can use gateway policies to defend against them. So the type of attack will depend on what the attacker is trying to achieve, all right? They may just want to take your API offline. So the old distributed denial of service attack. Or they may drop a payload bomb, just oversized payload or extremely nested or infinitely nested, even JSON or XML objects that caused your CPU to just overload. Or maybe they want to breach your data. So they might do a SQL injection attack. Or even worse, they might want to just encrypt your data for, ransom. So they might inject some type of malware or virus in order to achieve that. Then there's the classics. Man-in-the-middle attack, request sniffing, insufficient authorization checks, or there may be an attack that doesn't even look like an attack, right? So some time ago, there was a pagination attack on a website I won't mention, where they just harvested data by hitting an open API and page through the data for months. So then they could take that harvested data and use that for targeted spear phishing attacks, for example. Then there's the what the heck just happened attack. Well, that's what I call it anyway, emerging threats, right? So you've got to be able to be agile enough to, once you detect a new kind of attack, defend against it. So the way to do that in my world is using an API gateway and forcing all requests to go through the gateway and then defining API security policies to defend my APIs. So in our gateway, we've got a hierarchy of policies. At the top level, I've got threat protection. Threat protection policies protect the entire gateway with certain exceptions against things like distributed denial of service attacks or SQL injection or payload bombs. Then the next level, I've got global policies. Global policies I can apply globally, or I can filter which APIs these policies are going to apply to. Then I can also define API scopes. So for example, I've got a group of APIs that all use the same protocols, all need the same types of defenses. So I'll define those as a scope and define policies at that scope. And then lastly, I've got the API specific policies. So here at the bottom, you can see I've got identify and authorize policies. The one with no icon is at the API level. The one with the scope is this API scope level. And then the one with the globe is the global policy. Only the global policy is active. So only the highest level policy takes effect. A productivity tool is API policy templates. So let's say I've got a standard group of policies, but I don't want to necessarily enforce them like a global policy. So I can create a policy template, and then my administrators can go in and apply the template. And then I can use that template. Sure. Gotcha. I'm happy to send out this presentation, by the way, in PDF form to anybody who wants it. So back to policy templates. So I can customize that template. I can add additional policies. I can remove policies that I don't need for that specific API, or I can use the template as is. And so the whole point of a template is simply to improve developer productivity. So this is what policy enforcement looks like. So I've got different phases, as I call them, of the API execution. So at the very first gateway, my request has to pass through threat protection policies. Those happen before I even get to the API. Once I get to the API, then I can enforce transport protocols. I can then identify who my user is or my application is and define the access or deny access. Then at the request policy or request processing, I can do things like data masking or payload transformations if I need to, or additional checks, where I might be checking some request headers for content type, for example. Then I've got my traffic monitoring, which is just going to log the requests. Then the routing itself, that's when I route to the API, the actual target endpoint. And we can do load balancing, we can do content-based routing, we can do context-based routing. So I can have different versions of an API and route to the version that I want to allow you to hit based on who you are or what type of data you're sending. Then I've got a traffic monitoring on the response side. Similar to request processing, I can do transformations on the response. And then I've got error handling policies that can trigger different events based on what happened that wasn't supposed to happen. Any questions so far? All right, so first up are threat protection policies. I'm not going to read these slides to you. These are just for your reference when I send it out. So what I do want to talk about is this diagram on the right. This is straight out of their user interface of the gateway. So based on which area I've got selected, I can see my request coming through. So the request comes through the blue line, threat protection, transport, identify, and access, routes out to the API, and then the response goes out the green line similarly. So without any further ado, let's do some demos. Am I talking too fast? All right, just checking, because I talk too fast a lot. All right, so here I've got two windows open. I had two windows open. All right. Technology does not like me today. Now, I have two windows open. This one is the cloud version. So this is my cloud tenant. This one is my local tenant, local installation. There's a third flavor called a micro gateway. Micro gateway deploys out to an Istio sidecar. So I can define the policies at the gateway, deploy it out to a Kubernetes node. But the user interface is common across all three versions. There are some subtle differences, and I'll point those out as we go. So I go to my APIs. Here I've got the classic pet store and an IBM Global Weather API. The pet store is what I'm going to be using the most. So here I've got my API. There's my defined endpoint, and then my gateway endpoints. And I can expose those as I choose. So on port 5511, that's HTTP, and then I've got a couple of HTTPS ports defined as well. Where to next? I think we go straight to policies. Policies. So this is where I'm going to define my threat protection policies. So, for example, I've got a global denial of service policy. So I just enable that. I'm looking maximum of 3 requests inside of 60 seconds with a maximum of 3 requests in progress, and then I'll block for 1 minute and send you an error message that says, hey, too much, too soon. So I enable that, save it. Actually, do that. Then I go to my postband client, send a request, send a request, send a request. Ah, too much, too soon. Easy enough. I can also deny by IP address. So I'll disable that one and do a denial by IP address. So here I'm doing the same thing. Notice it hit my global first because they get evaluated in order. So now, same thing, I'm looking for a maximum of 3 requests inside of 60 seconds. And when that happens, I'm going to deny your IP address. So this is how I defend against denial of service in another way. That's untrusted. Let me get rid of that. Come back into Postman. You look like a bot because it's still within that 1 minute interval from the previous set of requests. So that's how I defend against denial of service. Now look at my denied IPs. Oh, it didn't. What the? Why are you not there? That's weird. Let me try that again. So now I can see my IP address was added. Now I can also decide, you know what? I trust me. I just don't trust anybody else. So I'm going to copy that, delete it from my denied list, add it to my trusted list. Save that. And now I'm back in business. Next up, I have rules. So if I add a rule, I've got a lot of different options for what kind of rules I can add. Right? So I can set up specific alerts for that rule. I can specify the message size, enforce OAuth, screen for different applications, prevent SQL injection, do a call out to an antivirus scan provider, as long as they support the ICAP protocol. Look for deeply nested JSON, and the same with XML. Then I can also create what's called a custom filter. So since my API gateway is actually running on a web methods integration server, I can define a service on that server that does processing or evaluation of that request and then allow or deny it as I choose. So now that I've talked about that, let me just go in and look at some rules. So the very top rule I've got is large payload. So I'm going to take a look at that. What that's doing is deny any payload larger than 1 megabyte. So I can enable that rule. Again, these are evaluated in order. So now I've got to create pet with a ridiculously long URL. Send that through. And its payload must be no larger than 1 MB. For SQL injection, I can do the same. So in this case, I'm doing SQL Server Detection along with standard SQL injection. So again, I'm going to enable that. Let me not enable it yet. SQL injection. So here's my create pet, and the name of my pet is union select username and password from users. Luckily, I don't have that table. So I just created the pet with that SQL name. So now I can go back to my gateway, enable SQL injection check. Now when I send it through, denied. Simple as that. Next up, I've got my custom filter for checking content type. So I created a service, and that service resides on my local integration server. So there it is, custom filter. So here I've got my, where's it at? Invalid content type. Now instead of setting JSON, I'm setting just plain text. Even though it looks like JSON, the content type header is set to text plain. And this actually went out to the pet store API. And I don't want that to happen. So I enable my custom filter. Try it again. Content type must be application JSON. Next up, I've got my JSON threat protection. So in this case, I've got several different filters enabled. So I'm looking for no more than 1024 objects, no more than 256 elements in an array, name and values cannot be longer than 256, and a container can't have more than 128 children. And this applies to all applications/JSON. I can add additional content types if I choose. So without it, again, sending in too long of a string for the name, or URL actually. And it works. I don't want that to happen. So I'll go and enable my JSON filter. JSON size of depth limit exceeded. Again, all these messages are customizable. Next up, I've got my untrusted application. So in this case, I'm looking for an app called Untrusted App on a Samsung device of version 0 or higher. So if I'm going to use a mobile application, then that will enforce a couple of header checks. So when I go to send my application in, I've got to tell it my device type, my application name, and the version. If I don't have any of those headers, then it's assumed to be an untrusted application and gets denied. So here I've got my untrusted app. Which is still hitting my API. I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to enable this rule. I tell it an application name. So those are request headers. So mobile device type, mobile application name, mobile application version. So those headers become required. So without those headers, if I've enabled that rule, then denied. So for example, create pet, I don't have those headers. Did I enable it yet? I did not. I did. So without those headers at all, your app is not trusted. with those headers and my, yes.
But we can manually add the headers, right?
The client application will have to provide those headers.
No, but how? Similar to the way you did, you added the header, then you can do it in curl as well. Curl command or in Postman or in somewhere or in Virtual. So
Yes.
you can add a custom headers in there.
But you know, with the policy or the rules are, hidden away from the pattern.
Consumer will not know it. No, but I can make a legit request. I can capture that through Virtual. I see what headers are there, and then I replace similar headers in the request that I want to send as an header.
Yes, you could.
So that would be, then how do we solve that problem? Like, how can we know that an editor is adding a custom headers and it was not present before? So then the app would be an untrusted app. Or else the server will take it as trusted app, right? Because it has all the headers, legitimate headers.
Correct. So there's no solution that's 100%. So in that case, what I might be looking for is properties of the device itself.
So can we find out that if the headers were met, like the integrity of the packet was destroyed or not? Like the headers were manually headed with the help of the content. So
You can check, I think one thing very common is, when people check the webhook, is that getting the hash, because the hash, you can add a salt, salt hash, so that you can check the hash if it matches. That's a possible solution.
Right? That's one way. Another way is there's some deeper things I'm going to get into. Okay? That, for example, I can look at IP addresses. I can look at a number of different factors, which I'll get to. Okay?
Using these policies, can we protect some parts of the data, basically API as some protected data, social security.
What's that now?
Some protected data is there in the response.
Right?
Depending on who the call is, can we hide the data?
Yes. I'll get to that.
One last question. Are there any performance trade-offs?
There's always performance trade-offs, but you can see the response time is not impacted very much by these checks. The biggest lag is getting from my laptop to swagger.io and back.
And I'd rather have a safe system than one that's faster and compromised.
Yep. I mean, it's always a trade-off between performance, security, and money. So now I'm going to try to send my untrusted app. Session expired. App is not trusted. I can send for my trusted app, which is just a different app that's I've got also defined. And it worked.
One other question. So is it possible to set rules like in a hierarchical fashion? If this, then this, then this, then this, then this, or how does that work?
No, you can't really like do an if then else on rules, no. But the rules will always get evaluated in order, right? So just checking this application header, for example, may not be enough. Maybe I need to look for an API key, which I'm going to show you in a minute. All right, so that is all of those. All right, let me undo that one. And the rest of these should be okay. So next up, I have global policies. So one that's system defined, enabled by default, is transaction logging. So I can turn that off if I want, but in this case, I don't want. Then I can define the different levels of my API. So in this case, I'm using a filter that applies to REST and OData and all of the REST methods. So this is going to show me down here which APIs pass those filters. So then I go to policy configuration and I got my little diagram. and I go to my enable HTTP, HTTPS, and this is going to be HTTPS only. So I'm going to activate that global policy. And now when I try to call using HTTP, transport protocol not supported. So now I have to call it with HTTPS. And that works. Then I've got required API key policy. So again, I go to policy configuration, and now I've got my identify and access policy, and I'm going to tell it, look, it's got to be a registered application, and you're either I'm going to identify you through either basic auth or through an API key. So let me activate that. So now if I try to do a get inventory without a key, unauthorized application request.
So on that token, can you tie the context of the authorized or authenticated user by a certain certificate or key, or basically it has a role associated with it, and then apply customized policy to only that role?
I cannot apply a policy to a role, but I can authorize specific roles, users, or teams. And actually not role, we call them groups. But so if I go into my administration, I can define my key stores and use those to identify. I can also do global IP blocking. Define SAML issuers, Kerberos issuers, OAuth, OpenID, JWT providers, all of that. So I can identify users multiple ways.
But not in a group, because sometimes, some of them, the threat detection rules are a little bit too restrictive, and then it will kind of impede normal use, I say, like legit users, right?
Right.
So when you have some, say, for example, one of those power users, they want to hit the API like much more frequent than the rest of it. So can you, define, say, a group of those users that belongs to that?
Like,
that way you can just hit a regular, won't change the rules applied to the regular user, but it's kind of the more strict rules, the relaxed rules will be applied only to a group of people or a role in that case.
I have to look.
Okay.
Could that be handled through your trusted list of IP addresses?
Definitely through trusted list of IP addresses.
Yeah,
But I don't know if we can do it by user or group.
It's static, right? Hard to, to identify, but when you have a group of users that come in with so-called context, basically you authenticate it, you have some special token or a key or certificate that will allow you to have more rights. This is sort of a general scheme for like zero trust.
Right.
Basically, you can come in and because of you possess some kind of a special context that will allow you to have more rights.
Like I said, I have to look. Give me a second. So here you can see I can define users, assign the users to groups, and assign groups to teams. So that part we've got, and I know I can authorize specific users and groups and teams if I'm using the on-prem version. On the cloud, that's not there.
And you also have the LDAP configuration.
Correct.
So, bind a role to something.
Yes. So now if I go into my global policies, If I go to global denial, I don't think I can bypass it. No, there's no bypass. So I'll feedback. I'll take that to my project manager or product manager.
You get what I'm trying to say.
I do. So if I want to be able to bypass the DDoS rule for certain groups. I got you. All right. Yeah, like I said, I'll raise that with the product manager as a feature request. Where was I? Global policies, I think. That's done. Talked about users, groups. All right, now I'm going to go into my API itself. Oh, by the way, this is where I define my applications, and that's where my API key is tied to that application, so I identify the application. So then I've got my pet store. This is where I define my policies. I've got a scope called pet APIs. So this applies to all of the pet resources, but not, for example, the store inventory. So then I've got my threat protection. Threat protection here is read-only. But I can see what's applied and what's not. At the transport level, I've got my enable HTTP or HTTPS. Here, it's enabling both, but overridden by the global policy. Set media type allows me to default the content type and accept headers if they're not present in a request. And then on the on-prem version, I can actually enable the API to be called by messaging or for the API to call a message. Under identify and access, on-prem, I can authorize specific users, groups, and teams. And in this case, I'm just doing my HTTP basic auth and API key to identify my users. And then I've got a custom extension as well, where I can actually do a call to an integration server service and then allow or deny that call based on what that service finds in the request. Request processing, again, I can invoke a service. I can do some type of request transformation. Validate, that's another good one. I can validate against the API spec. Does your request, is it valid or not? I can do data masking on the request, which allows me to mask data that gets logged. So for example, you send a credit card number through, I can mask that and just put the last four in the log itself, for example. And then again, custom extensions. Then I'm going to route out to the actual endpoint. I can do content-based, conditional routing, dynamic routing, load balancer routing. I've got a lot of options here. Also, I can look for a custom HTTP header and route based on that. Then I can actually route to messaging if I choose. And then the other good one is outbound authentication. So let me go ahead and edit this. So then I can authenticate using a variety of ways. Kerberos, NTLM, OAuth2, JBT, anonymous. I'm not going to send any user information, or I can specify an alias. I can either use my own credentials or do a pass-through of the credentials. And that's my options there. Traffic monitoring, I can do things like just log the message, monitor performance, monitor SLAs. Traffic optimization, I don't like that name. That's really throttling. So if I get too many requests within too short of a time, then I can send an alert and then deny you for a period of time. Consumer This is probably a way to do what you want to do. Specify which applications to allow. You can also cache service results, give me a little performance boost if the data is not changing.
But the global policy supersedes this.
Global policies always supersede.
You need to override it at a certain level first in order for it to be.
You're right.
Have this taking effect.
Exactly. All right, the last thing I want to show you is data masking. Because apparently I'm running out of time since I got a late start. All right, so data masking, I'm going to add a data masking policy. Bring a little cheat sheet. So in this case, when I do my inventory, I don't want to show you what's not available. So I add my masking criteria. I've got all my standard request parameters, response parameters in this case. Or I can do my custom and then mask it with whatever I like. Add that, save that. And now when I do my get inventory, here's my unavailable is 2. Now my unavailable is XXX. Here is where I'll switch between my pet APIs and my API scope. So this is where I come in and here now I can see I've got my scope level that's overridden by my global. Any questions? All right, thanks. Appreciate your time.